Hello and welcome to Not to Get Political, the podcast where we delve into the world of politics and hope to remain unscathed. Today I'm joined by Femi, a political activist who rose to prominence during Brexit as a Remain campaigner. He has appeared on TV and written articles for various media outlets. His activism at the moment is centred around proportional representation. Femi,
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Pleasure to be here.
First of all, how are you? How are things?
Oh, I'm good. The state of the UK is awesome. Everything's going well. So it's good to be here.
How did you get into politics? What was the moment for you?
I guess the moment was I was working in Brussels on human rights, especially the Gulf states of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. And I was watching the Tories basically praising the arms industry, which we were selling bombs to Saudi Arabia, which they were using to bomb hospitals and schools in Yemen. So blatantly committing war crimes. And we were pushing back in Brussels with British members of the European Parliament against the bad stuff the Tories were doing. And so when Brexit came up, I was like, okay, things might get even worse. There may be even fewer restrictions on what the Tories can do. And they may use that as a way to say, all right, we're going in a completely different direction and we're going to be really bad with human rights. And so I was right.
And so that for you was the point where you're like, right, so you were in Brussels, right? So you're in Belgium.
Yeah, I was in Belgium. I was working for the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights. And I had 20 followers on Twitter, and I was looking at the conversation around Brexit being led by Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson. On the other side, you had Jeremy Corbyn, David Cameron, and I could see that none of them had any clue how to deal with this.
Because that's what I noticed. I read your Wikipedia page. How does that feel to have your own Wikipedia page?
Yeah, it's fun.
Who set that up? Do you know who set it up?
I have no idea, but it makes Tinder interesting. Because, it's obviously going on Tinder as a woman has never been the most straightforward and safe activity. But at least if they can Google you, that's definitely advantage.
And do you find that it's it works in your favour, or is it working against it?
Well, it definitely means if they're a staunch, hard Tory Brexiteer, then I get to weed out some of the.
I see.
Yeah.
And have you managed to convince people? Or change people's views on certain things?
I have definitely had arguments in the first couple of messages on Twitter, on Tinder, because of Brexit. And some of them, I've gone on the first date and they have not been on my page, and we've sat through the entire date. I call it a date. You can see the vibe. And haven't managed to convince them.
So you can't really separate your love life from from politics.
Well, that's the thing. People say why can't you be friends with somebody who's on the other side of the political spectrum? Yeah, but the stuff that we're talking about these days, it's so fundamental to who you are as a human being, whether or not you prioritize morality.
I guess that's the thing, because I've heard that argument as well, and it's people are allowed to have different opinions on what toppings belong on pizza, or cats or dogs, not on whether people deserve human rights. It's that sort of thing. And I've never really understood the people that sort of push back on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you say, I like Star Wars and she thinks that's too nerdy, that's okay to say,
I'll go.
She's got to go.
She's got to go.
But if I think that refugees shouldn't be sent to Rwanda as a punishment, you're just being too picky.
Yeah. So, because I know, is it Hinge? I don't use dating because I know you can set your. I've seen it people have posted screenshots on Twitter and other socials of their Hinge profiles and other people's Hinge profiles, and you can set your political leanings.
Yes.
But as far as I'm aware, it's you got conservative and then there's moderate, but there's nothing left of that.
So yeah, what you've got is with most of them, you've got conservative, moderate, and liberal. And Bumble, I think, has now taken it a step further and they've added in left.
Right.
So I'm curious to see what's on the other end, if they've gone one further than conservative.
So I'm a theocratic fascist. Take it or leave it. Going back to your Wikipedia page, the quote that I saw, you basically saw the way that the Remain campaign was being run, and you were like, the arguments that should convince people aren't convincing people because they're not being put across properly. So you pack your stuff up in Brussels, come back to the UK. Let's go from there. What happened?
Oh, it was a slightly more complicated story than that. It was I started Twitter whilst I was in Brussels, and then whilst I moved to Vienna, I called up Nigel Farage on his radio show a bunch of times, and basically managed to systematically get him to admit all the lies that he told during the referendum campaign.
So give us like the first one where you did that.
The first one was me explaining what the single market is, because that was the main thing that they failed to do in 2016. Basically means that if you have 28 different countries regulating all their products in their own way, putting different laws on what you can put in this drink or medicine, etc., then if you wanted to sell to those 28 different countries, you'd have to market, package, and manufacture your product in up to 28 different sets of rules, which would make it much more expensive, raise prices in the shops. So because EU countries make laws together, there's only one set of rules to follow, which means you can make stuff a hell of a lot more cheaply, and that improves standard of living. And yet the entire narrative in 2016 was, let's take back control of our laws, which just means you've created a barrier which adds cost. That's just what you do by definition. And I was making the point that if you've got these smaller companies, they can't afford to do that. But the larger ones, the large multinationals, they can. So this Brexit that was sold as this victory for the little guy against the elite was designed to help multinationals get an advantage. And so I got him to admit that. But the main thing I got him to admit was on immigration. Because in 2016, he said, between now and June 23rd, we're going to make one very simple point. When Theresa May says that it's difficult to control immigration as a member of the EU, she's wrong. It's not difficult. It's impossible. There's nothing we can do to stop unlimited numbers of people from EU countries settling in this country and enjoying the same rights and privileges as all the rest of us. That's a direct quote.
And you remembered all of that?
Yeah.
Wow. I struggle to remember the scripts I write for this.
Well, I'm one of those annoying people that will come out of a cinema and just remember every single line.
Yeah.
And so I called them up and was just like, all right, so in 2016 you said that, but like, I'm reading right here, Article 7 of the EU Citizens' Rights Directive, which says, if you want to come to another EU country without a job, you need to either have a job or have sufficient resources not to become a burden on the welfare state and have your own comprehensive medical insurance. So this idea that the EU lets people come here without a job, live off benefits and clog up the NHS, that's literally illegal under EU law. And his response, in theory, Femi, you're right. In theory, under European treaties, there are restrictions that can be placed. What? 2016, there's nothing we can do to stop unlimited numbers of people from EU countries settling in this country and enjoying the same rights and privileges as all the rest of us. And he's saying exact opposite. And so it's because I managed to get the main people behind Brexit to admit, we lied to you. That sort of gave me a bit of a notoriety. My Twitter page started to grow. And come the end of 2017, I hooked up with a group of young people who created a network called Our Future Stop Brexit. I'd created an online platform, not separate Twitter account called Our Future, Our Choice. And because mine had the cooler acronym, we went with OFOC. And so came back to the UK, we started doing that, managed to get a letter in The Guardian to Jeremy Corbyn basically saying, hey, stop supporting Brexit, young people don't want it. And that got me on Sky News, and then it just sort of grew from there.
So, wow, that's fucking... So I'm interested, you basically got Farage to admit that this stuff wasn't, but what he was saying wasn't true.
Yeah.
But yet, Leave still won. Why do you think that was?
So that was the timeline issue, because in 2016 I was not calling up Nigel Farage. In 2016 I had 20 followers on Twitter. I was calling up Nigel Farage in 2017. So we were still Brexit was still going on. It was those 3 years of absolute chaos, and yet I managed to get him to admit that, and yet we didn't have the election, which actually sent us out of the EU 2019 until 2 years later. And in that election, as I've said, we'll go into PR in a second, 52% of voters chose parties that had promised a second referendum. So if all votes had counted equally in that election, we'd still be in the EU. So Leave won in 2016. It didn't really.
Well, obviously, they'll cite the 2016 referendum that said 52% of the country wants to leave, and it's kind of that idea of this was the big thing, because I was part of People's Vote. I wasn't like a paid up member, but I went on the marches. I went there because for me Brexit was a personal thing. I think like with you, it was the thing that got me involved in politics. I was 16 when it happened. And for me, like personally, coming from like my family having a dad that isn't British, for me it felt personal, because it was like, because I think because immigration, for example, was so big, and it was like take back control of the borders, all of this stuff, and for me it felt personal, because I was like, well, what have we done? It's like, what have I actually, like, obviously not maybe for me, but it's like, what's my dad done? My dad's lived in this country since 1998, has worked here all of his life, but worked here since he's moved to this country, has never claimed a penny off the state. What's the issue? And then you kind of get into the nitty gritty and you realize it's not so much European immigrants that is the issue, it's non-European.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's not really anything to do with Brexit.
So the immigration arguments were so nuanced, and so it had so many different angles to it. So yeah, there's the element that you would have felt where it felt so personal, like a personal attack on you. And I felt that too, because if the rhetoric of Nigel Farage had managed to convince the majority of British voters, maybe someone like me isn't welcome here. That was how I felt when I woke up on the 24th of June, 2016. Because Nigel Farage, as you said, his rhetoric was supposedly about EU migration, but it was really about brown people. If you remember
the breaking point.
Exactly.
Poster.
Because the UK wasn't part of the EU's common asylum policy, which means that none of the people in that photograph had any rights based in the EU to come to the UK. The only way they could possibly come to the UK is if they stayed in, for example, Germany for 7 years, learnt German language, were integrated in German society, and became German citizens, at which point your only criticism is their ethnic origin.
See, I remember there's a video of you talking about that.
Yeah.
And you put that, you set up the stalls talking with people. What was that like? Because that must be a really, it must be quite nerve-wracking.
The thing is, in terms of my confidence when it comes to discussing Brexit, the irony is I moved to Brussels at the end of 2014, and I had my French language speaking schools were awesome. Like I got a distinction in spoken French at uni. I was basically fluent and basically native, and I got my law degree, and I went over there thinking I was, can I say the shit?
Yeah, you can swear. Yeah.
I went over there thinking I was the shit, and I then got there, and then everybody there can speak like 5 languages. Everybody has worked in Brussels and EU affairs for 30 years.
Yeah, welcome to Central Europe.
Yeah. And I was just like, okay, I'm officially not the shit. And I would never in a million years have called myself an expert on the EU, because I was working with actual experts on the EU. But you take a look at the conversation around the EU and the UK, I'm basically Einstein by comparison.
And one of the things that was levied to you all the time, and I remember every time when I saw you on the news, saw you on sort of doing anything, was this idea that you were trying to subvert democracy and that you were basically going against the will of the people. We want it out. Simple as, enough said. Why do you hate this country? That was basically kind of how it felt. How did you respond to that?
So there were 2 ways. The main one I made was look at the DUP. The DUP represent a significant part of 52%. They voted for Brexit, they support Brexit, and they rejected Boris Johnson's deal. I mean, the entire narrative and discussion around Brexit and the way people think of Brexit as a concept was wrong from day one. Ultimately, we can all agree that if we're talking about leaving the European Union, then it's a question of international relations. What is the basis of all international relations? Treaties. So are we going to say that the relationship between the UK and the EU can only either be Remain or Boris Johnson's deal? No, it can be, in that referendum, the choices were Remain, which is the EU treaties, or literally any other relationship we could possibly have with the EU. And the analogy that I use is, if you signed a contract with somebody which had 4 words, leave the European Union, and then 3 years later, the person you signed that contract with added 1,000 pages of extra terms and conditions and then said, hey, you already signed. That's bullshit. And that's why you ended up with major parts of the 52% saying, no, we don't want this. In fact, Nigel Farage in 2019, he was saying on his show, somebody said, there's going to be a referendum between Boris Johnson's deal and Remain. And he said, you know what, Colin? And Remain wins that referendum and wins it every single time. Even Nigel Farage said that people would rather be in the EU than leave on the terms that we did.
But inevitably we did.
We did.
So let's talk about that. So the 2019 election rolls about. It's kind of it felt like a sort of like a final battle in a way. Mm-hmm. Of like, if we're going to put to me, the 2019 election felt like Revenge of the Sith, where it just felt like everyone just kind of lost. And I'm not saying the Tories are the Empire or Boris Johnson's Darth Sidious, because I wouldn't give him that sort of clout. Not that he really needs it from me. But that's so there's that period, and I remember you were like vote tactical, do all of that. A lot of people saw that as you kind of dismissing the Labour Party or sort of any sort of endorsement of the Labour Party.
In what sense?
So I remember because you were very critical of Corbyn's stance when it came to Brexit.
Yes.
It was very much like Corbyn probably didn't support Brexit. Why neoliberal institution and all of that, very much anti.
Didn't support the EU.
Sorry,
didn't support the EU.
Didn't support the EU. But sort of voted out in 1975 for the EEC. Said in 2017 that the Labour Party was going to respect the result of the referendum. Did better than anticipated in 2017 for that election. Come 2019, obviously the political landscape has changed. There's a new Tory leader in town. He is very much it felt like he was kind of, when I look back on it now, it's like he was forced to accept sort of like putting a second referendum on the ballot paper, if you will, to try and win that support. And in the end, that was kind of part of the reason that they did so badly in 2019.
I've heard this argument so many times, and it's arguably the worst form of gaslighting I've ever really experienced.
Why is that?
Because ultimately, when it comes to Brexit, you can do Brexit in one of two ways. You either leave the EU and don't follow the rules of the EU, you take control of your laws, in which case, as I explained, you end up with having different laws on either side of the border between Dover and Calais, which adds friction and red tape and adds cost, and we're seeing the damage of that now. And as a leader of the Labour Party, a party that's supposed to represent the working class people, you know that any significant damage to the economy is going to be felt the worst by the very people you're supposed to be standing for. So no leader of the Labour Party can ever offer that. And so what he went for was you leave the EU, but you keep following the rules of the EU. He said that you have to, he said the benefits of the single market are essential to jobs and Labour will always put the jobs first. That was in his 2017 manifesto, which means we will basically stay in the single market. But that means you're following the rules of the EU, but without having any votes on those rules, which means you're ending up with less control over your laws than we did as EU members. And you're doing that in the name of people who wanted to have more control. So your only options are do a Brexit that betrays working class people despite being the Labour Party, or do a Brexit that Brexit voters don't want at all and would actually prefer remain. So his position was stupid from day one. Now, the argument gets put that, well, he managed to do very well in the 2017 election. A, he didn't win. B, I voted for him in that election. And I voted for him because the only options there were the Tories basically saying, we're going to go for a hard Brexit, or Jeremy Corbyn saying, we're going to have a soft Brexit, i.e. those two options of Brexit that I mentioned. And under those circumstances, many people, out of desperation to try and avoid a hard Brexit, voted for Jeremy Corbyn. Now, after that, when Theresa May negotiated her deal, which was actually a harder, more damaging Brexit than the one that Jeremy Corbyn was offering, that suffered the worst parliamentary defeat in the history of the UK. Nobody wanted that. Boris Johnson said it was worse than Remain. Jacob Rees-Mogg said it was worse than the Remain. This was something that Brexit voters did not want. Now, the Brexit that Jeremy Corbyn was offering was even more damaging than that.
But do you think the reason there was
even more soft than that?
But do you think that the reason there was that resistance was just because of Theresa May as a person and kind of what she represented within the Tory party as such, and it was like, that's not what we want. That's not the person who can sell this product.
You could argue there was an element of, can you sell it? And arguably Boris Johnson's deal isn't that dissimilar to Theresa May's, but Theresa May's did include things like the common rule book. So basically keeping the whole of the UK in the single market for a bit, and then the customs union permanently. So basically not able to do our own trade deals pretty much ever. So it was the sort of thing that it did have similarities with what Jeremy Corbyn was offering, but it was slightly harder in the sense that England, Scotland and Wales would leave the single market but stay in the customs union. So what Jeremy Corbyn was offering was something that was softer than something Brexit voters hated because it was too soft. Now, if Brexit voters hated Theresa May's Brexit because Theresa May was at the head of it, what do you think they'd have thought of Jeremy Corbyn's? There was no way that Jeremy Corbyn could stand on a Brexit that A, went exactly in the opposite direction of what Brexit voters wanted and pissed off Remainers at the same time. It was insane. And even Barry Gardiner, the closest ally of Jeremy Corbyn, said that it would turn us into a vassal state. And he warned that Brexit voters would not be happy with the type of Brexit that Jeremy Corbyn was offering. And so the only legitimate thing that a leader at the Labour Party could do would be to offer a second referendum. Because in 2017, I think it was just after the election, he went on the Marr show, and Marr pointed out that like 80% of your members want to remain in the EU. They want a second referendum. They want to stay in the single market. Why aren't you doing that? And he said, well, yes, the overwhelming majority of Labour members and supporters voted to remain, but a third of them didn't. I want to win the next election. He knew that his party didn't want it. He knew that he was going against the wishes of left-wing people across the country.
But then obviously he's got the case where he's looking at his own party, but obviously his party and the membership will represent a very small percentage of the wider electorate. And he's got to appeal to the entire electorate in order to win.
Yeah, and well, for starters, he has to appeal to Labour voters in general. Overwhelmingly voted Remain. He admitted that, as we said. And as I said, the Brexit that was on offer would not have helped him. Let's be clear on this. A Remain policy, a second referendum policy, more popular than a soft Brexit policy, because everybody hated that for the reasons I've just described. Brexit voters hated it because it meant less sovereignty than we had as EU members. Remainers hated it because it meant leaving the EU and having less control, because we also care about that as well. He was offering something that even his own right-hand men were saying, nah, nobody wants this. And, I mean, I think the best way of putting it is, if I was in his position, what I would have done on day one after the referendum in 2016 would be to say, all right, the majority has voted for Brexit. But during this referendum campaign, the Leave campaign has offered several different options as to what Brexit would be. Some of them said we could be like Norway. Some of them said we could just stay in the customs union. Some of them said we'll have a basic free trade deal like Canada. Some of them wanted no deal at all. So what we're going to do is, I think we should have town halls in every constituency across the UK. Each MP will discuss with his constituents and find out what they want in terms of their relationship with the EU. Then each MP will come back to Parliament and they will vote on whatever deal they want to negotiate for. We will then negotiate for that, and whatever deal comes out of that, we then put it against Remain in a referendum. That is the most democratic way of doing Brexit imaginable. Otherwise, you end up with a Brexit that most Brexit voters don't want.
And then what happens? Let's say that happens, right? That idea happens. Then you get your vote, you put it back to a second referendum, and people go, "No, don't want that." Do you go back again?
If they vote to Remain, that means that despite wanting,
well, so you give them that option. You give them this is the deal option. So how many options are going to be on this ballot paper?
you'd have to have two.
Just two.
Yeah, because I mean, for starters, the notion of putting no deal on the ballot paper is insane, because almost 95% of the Leave campaign was, we'll get an amazing deal. So once you've got your deal, you have to put that against Remain. That is the logical thing to do.
Let's kind of move on from Brexit, which I feel like a lot of people wanted to do. I feel like it was the reason a lot of people couldn't speak to members of their family for about 2
There
years.
is no moving on from Brexit until it's reversed, because we're seeing the effects of it every single day.
So how is Brexit affecting our day-to-day?
So in terms of the day-to-day, it's increasing costs. Now, yes, obviously that's being masked to a certain extent by COVID, by Ukraine, but we know that the Small Business Federation, which represents the small businesses across the UK, they say that half of their businesses, 70% of their businesses have had difficulty selling to the EU. 25% of their businesses have stopped selling altogether. And the British Chamber of Commerce says that 1 in 5 export businesses have stopped selling to the EU altogether. And that is because the extra red tape, the extra bureaucracy of having different laws to the place where you're selling your products is adding costs and simply pricing many businesses out of that market. And when you have lots of businesses leaving the market, other ones raise their price, other ones capitalize, there's less competition, and it makes situations like COVID and Ukraine even worse. You've also got the issues of the lack of staff, because we've seen that in the supply chains. We've seen that we've had issues of workers who left the UK during COVID and didn't come back because of Brexit. And then you've got the issue of the NHS. The NHS, the Nuffield Trust, they've said that Brexit is damaging the NHS. And that's one of the things that we predicted all along. In fact, every single medical organization in the UK said that Brexit would damage the NHS. And here we are in terms of making medicines more expensive, harder to get, reduction in the numbers of nurses and doctors coming over from the EU. All of these things are affecting our day to day. Not to mention the options that we have, especially as young people, to work in 31 countries across Europe. That's essentially gone unless you're rich.
You've said all of that. Why do you think that neither of the two main political parties in this country want to acknowledge the effect that Brexit is having on this country? Because it all seems to be the focus is on COVID, Ukraine, cost of living. Nobody seems to want to mention Brexit. It's a bad word. You can't say it without it all kicking off.
There are two sides to that. One, it's fear of what the Tories will do if Keir Starmer suddenly starts being seen to attack Brexit, because the Tories would love to fight an election to an extent on being the people that believe in Britain, being the people that believe in Brexit. And so he's scared. I think that fear is wrong, because there are definitely ways you can do it. And I'll get to that in a second. But there's also the acknowledgement, and this goes not just for the politicians, but also for the people in the media. Because the moment they accept just how damaging Brexit is, and the democracy argument that I mentioned, that you have not got a majority in favour of this Brexit, and you never did, because Boris Johnson's deal was never put to the people, you then realise that we've been led by people for 7 years who failed us on a historical level. So there's that, what if they realise what we've done? And there's, what if the Tories attack us for this? As for the Tories attacking Labour for it, that is an issue of, anytime I say that Keir Starmer needs to be better on Brexit, people say, well, he can't just come out and say that we should rejoin the EU because the Tories will kill him for it. He doesn't have to. Any leader.
I think it's not just the Tories; it's the media. It's what the public will say, because he was seen as one of the key pushers for a second referendum as Brexit secretary, and so obviously, if there's always that kind of thought in the back of people's heads who are politically aware, and they're like, well, he might want to do that, and he's very keen to sort of distance himself from those sort of allegations.
Given that, what is it, 2/3, a recent poll said that 2/3 of the UK are in favour of having a referendum on rejoining the EU. 56% think that it's a mistake. And a recent poll said there was 37% of Leave voters versus 22% think Brexit has failed. The public are pretty much where they need to be already.
But let's not kid ourselves that Brexit was where the things started going well. Obviously, that's where things started going wrong. But it happened way before that. You think sort of 2010, for example, where the Tories come in, implement austerity measures which crippled this country. Between 2010 to 2015, it's estimated that 50,000 people lost their lives as a result of the measures. Some figures say even 300,000. So it's kind of beyond Brexit. It's so systemic that Brexit is almost seen like I'm trying to think. It's like when people get like the like the glazing gun on Bake Off, and they glaze their banoffee pie that's completely fallen apart, and they go, "Oh, this looks okay." It's beyond that. I need to think of another analogy to give. We're gonna redo that bit. It's like the idea of if you've been cleaning your room, all right, and it's like, yeah, I've cleaned it, but all the shit that you've cleaned is actually in your cupboard. You haven't actually addressed the stuff's there. You haven't just redistributed that. You haven't put it away. You just put it to the side and hope that no one will open that door because it's all going to come back out. And that's kind of how I see a lot of the issues that are going on.
Oh, there's definitely a large part, but it is all part of the same story. I mean, often when I speak to people who voted Remain and they come from an area where everybody they know voted Remain, London would be a key example, I'll say, all right, imagine you are 50 years old, you live in Sunderland. When you were 11, your dad lost his job because Margaret Thatcher closed the shipyards and the mines. And you've watched your area get nothing from government forever. You've watched London get more investment every year, Millennium Dome, London Eye, underground tube system, which you've never seen anything like that in Hull. And you voted Labour all your life because you've hated the Thatcher and the Tories and what they did to your town. And you never vote Tories. And so therefore the Tories know they're never going to win your vote. Labour knows they're always going to win your vote. So there's no actual political incentive to do anything for you. And so politics very much has left you behind. And then you get to 2016 and you've just been through 6 or so years of austerity. And the person telling you to vote for status quo is David Cameron, the same person who's put you and your family through 6 years of austerity. Under those circumstances, take away my law degree and my EU experience, I'm voting Leave every single goddamn time. So austerity and Brexit are fundamentally linked because it is in that context that people desperately needed change. And they were told that Brexit was a way to do that. And
Brexit's always seen as a protest vote. That's kind of like what the researchers suggested. I know, like Matt Goodwin, with a lot of the research that he's done with Brexit, he's kind of linked. He's mentioned what you said about this idea about left behind voters, disillusion because of deindustrialization and watching the South grow, and basically fuck all going on in the North.
And I spoke to those people because I was out in the streets in 2016 before the referendum, and I spoke to at least 2 couples who came up to me once I was on the street, and they said they're voting Brexit to stick it to Cameron. And I fully get that, because if you're not an expert in EU law, which, let's be clear, people on both sides, most not expert. As I said, I remember I told you how I did not consider myself to be an expert in EU law at all. Most people, definitely not experts in EU law, remain or leave. And under those circumstances, you vote leave under those if you want to give Cameron a kicking. And so
that's actually a question I want to ask you. Sorry, sorry to interrupt. But this was a question we asked another guest. Who do you think the worst leader has been for the last 20 years? We'll say 20 years. Cameron.
Yeah.
Why?
Because the UK is right now I think it's the 4th most financially unequal country in Europe. There was a way of handling the post financial crash era in a way that didn't do the damage that he did to it. And not only did he do that damage, he then let the tiger out of the cage by opening the door to Boris Johnson. And he put Brexit on the agenda as a way to save his votes from UKIP that were starting to eat away at his vote share. And that then led to everything. So he's not just responsible for austerity, he's responsible for everything that followed, because he basically opened that gate and then walked away.
And it's almost, that's the thing. He has sort of walked away. There's no, that's the thing. He's walked away and people have kind of almost forgotten about him. I think because of how terrible Liz Truss was. It's almost like, David Cameron is he must be fucking ecstatic that he's kind of been able to go away, write a book, make a shit ton of money, working in the city, doing speeches, and he's kind of walked away scot-free. So your big thing at the moment now is PR, proportional representation. Why?
Because as it currently stands, we're not a democracy. To call the UK a democracy is an offence to the word democracy. If you look at every election that we've had, I think since the Second World War, for starters, the winning party almost never gets a majority of the seats, a majority of the votes in across the country, but they always get a majority of the seats in Parliament, which means they have majority control, which means they can pass any law they like without having to even talk to the other parties, the parties that the majority voted for, which means that the majority of votes in the UK never have any meaning at all. And if most votes are meaningless, you can't call that a democracy. And it's worse than that. It's that if you look at every single election we've had since the Second World War, the majority of votes have gone to parties to the left of the Conservative Party. So that we're talking Labour, SNP, Lib Dems, Greens. They've had 50% plus of the vote in every single election apart from, I think, 3 elections. And yet the Tories have been in power for 47 of the last 77 years. So we consistently get governments that are more right-wing than the people themselves. And so when you see these right-wing agendas being pushed by governments as if they represent the people, they don't. The reason why that's allowed to happen is that under first past the post, it's done by constituencies, so your town, for example, and whichever candidate for a party comes first becomes the MP for that constituency. So if theoretically the Tory candidate gets 40% of the vote, and the Labour candidate gets 30% of the vote, and the Green candidate gets 30% of the vote, then even though the majority of people in that constituency, in that town, want relatively left-wing policies, they will be run by a Tory. Theoretically, if that happens in every single constituencies across the UK, 100% of MPs are Tories, even though 60% of people want left-wing policies. We're not a democracy. So proportional representation is a system of voting whereby the seats in Parliament match the votes of the people. Because currently under the first past the post system that we have now, basically it's done by constituencies or towns. So whichever MP comes first in each constituency becomes the MP for that town, even if they only get a minority of the votes. You end up with most votes essentially being wasted.
Yeah. So you want to bring in PR. What system are you advocating for?
So I don't think you should do straight PR, i.e. just add up all the votes across the country and then allocate them to each party. I think you have to have some element of regional PR. So for example, you'd say, London gets 15 MPs, and then you divide up the vote and allocate to each party based on that. Or West Midland gets 10 MPs, something like that.
So you want like a regional list system?
Yes.
But obviously, the issue with that is where basically the party could put forward a load of candidates, and it's like, well, I want to vote for this party, but I don't want so and so to be the MP of that, to be that.
And that'll be part of it. If that party puts forward rubbish candidates or candidates that are really problematic and put people off, they won't get the votes.
But obviously, one of the arguments for first past the post is that it keeps out extremist parties. So the obvious example in the last 20 years has been UKIP. In 2015, won 3 million votes, 15% of the vote share, only got one MP, Douglas Carswell, who used to be a Tory. So how, in that circumstance, let's say we have a PR system and a big extremist party get in, how are we dealing with that?
That's democracy. I mean, if 15% of our population votes UKIP, then 15% of our MPs should be UKIP. We shouldn't just hide. We shouldn't use a broken electoral system to hide who we are as a country, because that's not democratic. Second of all, it is because of that feeling of your votes don't count, which they don't under our current system, that people ended up feeling the need to take back control. That narrative was so useful in 2016 because people knew our voting system doesn't allow us to express ourselves. And so you had a lot of people going towards the extremes. Third of all, there's also the issue of, I don't want to have to fight these people in back alley Facebook groups. I would much rather fight these people in Parliament, where you can actually all address them. Whereas what we've seen a lot recently is these siloed conversations. They'll have these conversations on Facebook groups or on these chat rooms or on GB News or places where nobody really is paying attention. And so they'll just create these little echo chambers and they'll get more and more extreme. All that happens because those people aren't made to answer questions in public. For example, if UKIP had, for the last 20 years, been in Parliament putting forward their arguments for leaving the EU, they would have been publicly destroyed long before we got to 2016, because they'd had to say what sort of deal they want. How would that affect trade? They would have to answer all these questions, whereas instead, they threw it onto the table in 2016, got to present a wishy-washy, we'll leave, we'll sort it out, and then here we are. There's also the other issue of the argument that you said about how our first past the post system keeps extremists out of Parliament. Woo! Okay, so have you seen Parliament recently? The whole sending refugees.
I've had a glance. I've had a glance or two over the last few years. Yeah.
The United Nations said that the UK government is trying to normalize white supremacy. That's because they put out a race report that said it recognized that black people and people from ethnic minorities have to send roughly 70 to 90% more job applications when they're applying for a job in order to get a call back. But it might just be because the employer assumes that people from those backgrounds are of a lower class. So they just use classism to disguise racism. It also said that we need to start talking about slavery in terms of the how it allowed Africans to culturally transform themselves into Brits, as if slavery was basically Erasmus with chains. This is the government we're talking about: sending refugees to Rwanda, banning protest, banning strikes. If the role of this voting system is to keep extremists out of government, it's fucked up.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. I guess that's what's the film where the population, like, there's no more births and
Children of Men.
Yeah, and basically people asked the director, how did you write this? And he said, I just looked at it. Was when he published it, that film was produced in what, 2004, 2005. Around 2006, around the mid 2000s, and he basically said, I'm looking at the country now and where I think it will go in 20 years. And well, if you look at the rhetoric that they have around immigrants, so I'd say we're pretty close.
People look at proportional representation, so a system where the MPs in Parliament reflect the vote share that those parties get across the country, and they say, but we haven't done this. It will result in coalition governments of parties having to work together. That's what they should do. The idea that one party should be able to do whatever they want without having to even consult the other parties, that's not democracy, that's dictatorship. Second of all, we're the odd man out in Europe. Like, there's only one other country that uses first past the post in any form in its government, and that is Belarus, often referred to as Europe's last dictatorship. That's the company we're keeping right now. The idea that it would be crazy to go for proportional representation or some other system. No, we're the odd ones out. I didn't actually leave the Labour Party. I got kicked out.
When did you get kicked? Wait, sorry, when did you get kicked out?
So I joined the Labour Party at the end of December 2019. I think I got my membership card in January 2020, and I was kicked out on the 8 hours after lockdown was called. So 21st, I think, 23rd of
What was the reason
March.
that they gave for kicking you out?
So after I joined the Labour Party, having just spent 2 years being completely non-partisan and basically working with any party that wanted to stop Brexit, I put out a tweet basically saying, hey, anybody from the Lib Dems and Greens that's disappointed in me for joining the Labour Party, just know that my main objective is to get Labour to commit to proportional representation and do an electoral pact on that basis so that all votes for all parties would count equally. So your votes would actually matter. So me joining the Labour Party is actually the single best thing I could possibly do for your parties. And the letter that I got then said, you join the Labour Party to help other parties? You're not loyal? Bye. Which means that Labour was so tribal that even acknowledging that something they do could mutually beneficially help another party,
But the Labour Party at their last conference voted to put PR on their ballot paper.
I know, right?
But obviously Starmer has come out recently and said, yeah, that's not going to happen. But then he's also promised votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, and also votes for EU nationals, which I think is a good thing. But whether that gets rowed back on is probably likely to happen. So do you think you could probably get back in at this rate, or is there like
I honestly don't know, because when I joined Labour Party, it was still under Corbyn's leadership, and so I can understand why people close to him don't like me. But I then tried again in the summer when Starmer was there, and they still wouldn't let me in. So, and when I look at how the leadership acts towards the things that I think need to happen, so proportional representation, for example, that makes sense.
do you feel like you were unfairly discriminated against? Were you silent, or were you silent? I couldn't resist. We're gonna be serious. Okay, it's not that funny, bro.
Sorry, you just turned it into an Oprah interview. Okay,
Sorry.
Go on.
So, do you feel like you were unfairly discriminated against?
I feel like I was kicked out because of what I wanted to say.
But that's something that's been interesting, because the Labour Party at the moment, Channel 4 released something where they said that there are a group of black MPs that don't feel that the recommendations in the Ford report, particularly with sort of prioritising and treating all forms of racism equally, is being enforced. Those MPs don't want to go public because of fear of losing the whip. Almost sounds like you were kicked out from the sound, quite, I'd say unfairly.
Definitely unfairly.
So that at least to me looks like that you are part of the not when I say part of this issue, but there is clearly, well, I'm looking at a case in front of me right now that this is happening.
So, I think that was I unfairly kicked out of the Labour Party? Yes, because even the arguments they use for why I should leave, i.e., I joined the Labour Party to help opposition parties, that's not what I said. And the idea of kicking me out for supporting a policy that, as we just saw, the majority of Labour members also support, again, objectively unfair. As for the issue of did race play a part, that, without being part of those discussions, I cannot know. As for is Keir Starmer doing the right things? Is Keir Starmer's Labour Party as a whole doing the right things on race? I have to say no. The way they've handled the Black Lives Matter movement has not been good. Have they stood up for the issues of racism? No, because they're too scared of Tories and they're too scared of the right-wing press. And despite all the facts that I mentioned about how if you've got an ethnic minority sounding name, you have some more job applications to get a call back when you're applying for work. Those sorts of issues, they have not taken a stand in order to fix those things. So if I were to guess one way or the other, I'd guess probably that those problems did not help in my case.
We don't have to include this next bit, but do you not think that there is obviously like, oh, well, we're not going to do this because of fears what other people will say, but there's also that element of your own person saying, I don't want to talk about this. It's a personal choice that you make. Do you perhaps think that there is that reluctance from the leadership to address those sort of issues? Not because of who they are as people, not because of fears of what other people will say.
Are we talking about...
I'm saying, do you think Starmer's reluctance to kind of, with what you've just mentioned, do you think that's because of fears of what the electorate and what the Tories will say, or because of who he is as a person?
My views on Starmer as a person is he is a political animal. As for what he actually believes, I think much like Boris Johnson, I think that's almost irrelevant. Because I've met him twice, and on both cases he disappointed me. Once was at UCL when I was explaining to him that, look, you're supporting a version of Brexit that most Brexit voters don't want. What are you doing? And he just completely told the party line. But the second time was during the tactical vote campaign, and I was going around the country to different constituencies, and I was explaining to people, all right, in this constituency you vote Labour, in this constituency you vote Lib Dem, etc. That's the basis of tactical voting. And I just wanted to get a quick video with him basically saying, all right, in this constituency, Labour is the most likely to win. Here, you need to vote Labour. And he started with, because Labour is the only party offering a second referendum. Like, dude, what? No, that's the whole point. And his response was, oh, sorry, we're too tribal. Now, that could be a joke that's self-aware, but the fact that he's still going down that line of no to PR suggests that he was just saying, no, this is who we are. And so I think and we've seen what happened with the pledges, that he's dropped all of his pledges. He will do whatever it takes to do what he thinks will achieve power for himself, for Labour, probably himself. And so I do not trust him as an individual. However, we do need to realize that we live in a two-party system. So as far as moving forward, yes, Labour has to win, and we have to make sure that does happen. But if he doesn't completely switch a 180 as soon as he's in power and become everything he needs to be, he's got to go.
But is that likely to happen?
Yes, because he's a political animal. And if we can create an environment where it becomes politically toxic for him not to do the things we need, then he'll change.
How do you look after your mental health?
Therapy was a major one, because I got to a place whereby my mental health was at a life-threatening place twice in the last 3 years or so. Because I quit my job in Vienna. I'd had no social life. I was seeing somebody in Vienna. In fact, the last thing I did before I got into my car was kiss her goodbye, and that ended. I had barely any family life. And I was just on the road 24/7, just doing everything I could to stop Brexit. And I was getting death threats all the time, constant abuse all the time. And because I knew that the entire medical community was saying that Brexit would damage the NHS, I thought, all right, we've got thousands of lives on one side and my one life here. It's not a contest. I have to keep going. Death threats be damned. And so I didn't really care about my life at all through that entire period. And so figuring out how to actually focus on my life afterwards has required therapy. And that's what I'm doing now.
And has it been working?
I think it has. Just reminding myself that keeping myself happy is a goal in and of itself. It's not just something that I do so I can keep doing the work that needs to be done.
But with like all the trolls and all those sort of like the hate comments, you mentioned the death threats, obviously. How do you deal with that aspect? Because I don't see you. Like, do you block people? Like what do you do?
Unless they pose a threat to my physical person or my friends or family, I tend not to block unless they've got blue ticks. But that's another story.
Yeah, I think we've got time for blue ticks.
Yeah. I'm kind of numb to it. There's a line from Stargate, where Teal'c says, to resist the influence of others, knowledge of oneself is most important. I know who I am. I know why I do this. I know that I'm not doing it for clout. I'm not doing it for fame. I'm not doing it for money, because I don't fucking have any. I'm doing this because, well, I got into this because of human rights.
Are you hopeful for the future?
I am.
Why?
Because, as I said before, the majority of people in the country vote more progressive than the governments we're seeing, so that there is that overwhelming weight towards the right direction in the voters. And because we've seen major change within the Labour Party in terms of they voted for changing the voting system to one where all votes count equally, that potential for, well, the Tories to leave, which is most likely, and then for there to be some major change in how the system operates, huge. Not to mention our generations, mine, millennial, yours, Gen Z, we are not like the ones before us. I mean, there was a recent thing in the Financial Times which showed that the research shows that if you are boomer, silent generation, even Gen X, then when you were 35, you were 5 points less conservative than the national average. But by 60, you were 5 points more conservative. Yet with Gen Zs and yet with millennials, when they reach 35, they are 15 points less conservative than the national average. So we are actually bucking the trend. So we are going to see better politics moving forward. And if we do get PR, we will also start to be nicer to each other. So under the first past the post system, only one party can win and they take all the power, which means that anybody with an even slightly different point of view to yours is an existential threat. Whereas under a proportional system, it's designed to make us all work together.
Femi, before you go, thank you for coming on, mate. This is weird because I remember, like, I've got no shame in saying this. When I was first starting out producing, I've been watching your content since I was 16. So this is really weird for me, 6 years on, basically, to be sat opposite you, talking to you like this. Yeah, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Is there anything? And you were also, like, with the stuff that you've been putting together. I mean, I've always thought that it was great. There have been times where I've been like, okay, but there's been. I think that's the case with everyone.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
We want to be able to have disagreements and have that be okay. Otherwise, like I said, we shouldn't be in a situation where anybody with an even slightly different point of view to yours is an existential threat. We should be able to.
Unless they don't believe in human rights.
Of course.
Femi, thank you so much for coming on. And to all of you listening, thank you so much for the support that you've been showing this podcast. I really appreciate it. We will see you for the next episode. Thank you very much. See you soon.